That's the sound of my rear brakes, which is why I need to work on them. However, when I started to take the tire off here, you'll notice I'm missing a lug nut, and that's because it was cross-threaded, because tire shops are not great at properly torquing lug nuts. A lot of times they just throw an impact wrench on there, tighten them up as much as they can, and they have no idea if it's threaded properly or not. So while removing it, you can see the lug nut right here is sheared off. The lug stud is sheared off and it's cross-threaded into this lug nut. So when you have a stuck lug nut like this, you might be wondering, how do you get your tire off? Well, I just used the regular wrench that comes in the Kia Spectra tire kit in the rear trunk underneath the mat, and I was able to put enough leverage on it to completely shear the stud. So with the rest of the lug nuts loosened up, I can go ahead and remove the tire. Now I'm going to be using an electric impact, mainly because it's just easier and quicker to remove the lug nuts. But it's not a very high torque gun, and it also has variable torque control, so you can just slightly hold the trigger and you can spin the lug nuts off slower or faster, so that way you don't get anything cross-threaded. Plastic hubcap. Now you can remove this rim and tire. So what you have now is a pretty standard rotor and brake pad setup. It's pretty common on many vehicles. But you're going to start by removing the two caliper bolts, and there's one on the back side on the top and one on the back side on the bottom. Once you break it loose, you can usually remove them by hand. Once you remove those two bolts, you can remove this upper part of the caliper, and you want to make sure that you're not pulling on the brake line, so you just want to set it out of the way and not let it pull on the lines. Now we can pull these pads out, and these pads are fairly worn. There's not a lot of life in them, and if you look at this feature right here, that is what's making that bad brake squealing noise. That's actually designed into the pad to alert you when your brakes are getting low. So these pads are toast. So on the back side of this bracket, there's two other bolts. You see this one and this one on the bottom. Those are also a 14mm bolt. And we're going to remove those bolts so we can move this bracket to free the rotor. So with that bracket out of the way, the next thing to do is to look for the Phillips head screw that's holding this rotor on, and we're going to go ahead and back that off. Looking from the side, you can see that they're just pressed into this hub flange. You should be able to knock them out with a hammer. So the new stud has splines near the head, and that's going to give it a nice tight friction fit on the hole on the end of that axle flange. Now because of this shield, you're not going to be able to get a good hit on it with a hammer, but you just need enough to make it stay in place. Once you tighten the lug nuts down, it's going to pull it all the way into the flange. That's good enough. With a new rotor, it's going to have some type of oily residue on it. That's to keep it from rusting while it's on the shelf. So you want to make sure you take some brake cleaner and just spray it off and then wipe it down with a paper towel. I recommend using eye protection when using brake cleaner because it can splash back at your eyes and this stings. So after you've cleaned off that new rotor, you just want to find one of the countersunk holes that has a taper to it, and you want to line that up with the hole in the axle flange and line it up and just slide it on your lug studs. And you want to make sure that it's sitting and it's concentric with the hub, so you want to be pressing on opposite ends and make sure it's fully seated So now I'm going to go ahead and put the Phillips head screw back in place. So now that I have this rotor on, you can see which stud I replaced because it's not sticking out as far. So I'm going to go ahead and test fit the rim so I can go ahead and tighten up the lug nuts and use the torque on this lug nut to fully seat that stud. You want to be careful when test fitting the rim because you don't want to bump that stud and push it back out the other end of the axle flange. Alright, so I can tell that I've hit the wall on this lug stud. So this lug stud is fully seated. I'm just going to go ahead and break it loose and raise the car back up so I can finish assembling the brakes. So go ahead and clean this lower bracket and bolt it back to the back side of this spindle shield. So the two bolts that hold that lower bracket to the back here, I don't do a specific torque on these, but you want them to be as tight as you can reasonably get them using hand tools. Now with this lower bracket in place, you want to double check your rotor and make sure that it looks like it's spinning true and it's not rubbing. Looks good. When reassembling the new pads, you want to use some brake lubricant or just grease if you keep normal bearing grease around. So you want to put them on the back side of the pads and the friction and contact surfaces where it interfaces with this lower bracket. So go ahead and make your new pad to the lower bracket here. It can be a little bit difficult to get it to line up perfectly, but you do got notches that align with the features on the top and bottom of the pad. So now that you've got your rotor and your pads in place, it's time to go for your caliper. Because this hydraulic piston in your caliper pushes out as your pads wear down, you'll probably notice you don't actually have enough space in between these two surfaces to fit over a brand new rotor and brand new pads. So you need to retract this piston. Some of them you can just push in with a C-clamp, but this one actually has notches into it. And it mates with a certain type of socket or key and you can screw it back in. I don't have that, so I use needle nose pliers. And I have to line it in with the notches and try and turn it in this way. So the bolts that hold this caliper in place, they can be a little tedious to get aligned properly, and you might have to use a backup wrench to hold the caliper guide bolt from spinning while you tighten the bolt down. You want to get these pretty snug. That's my scientific recommendation, is not too tight but pretty snug. You know, they should be reasonably easy to break free with hand tools. You want to do the same thing for the bottom bolt. So with everything reassembled, you just want to double check this set screw, make sure that as you were putting everything back together, nothing shifted or came loose. Everything spins true, brake pads are in place, caliper bolts are all tight. So you want to go ahead and put your rim and hubcap back in place and get it snugged up. Drop that tire to the ground so that you have the weight of the vehicle on it before you do your final torque. And you want to make sure that your lug nuts are tight. You know, as tight as you can get them by hand, but you want them to be threaded cleanly onto the hub, because if you are in an emergency and you need to change a tire on the side of the highway, you want to make sure that you can actually get them back off. Oh, Oh my gosh. What the f... Oh shit, my GoPro just broke. The whole plastic... How the hell? Oh shit, now I feel bad that I sprayed brake cleaner at it.